So, what will you learn in this course? What kind of skills are you going to be taking away? I think a couple things. You'll learn formalism, how art is constructed, art history, the foundation of the stories of these art pieces. Why are they important? What kind of history do they have for us? Aesthetics, again, what is beauty? What is personal reaction? Religion, there's a lot of religious stories here to be learned. And then finally, my favorite, of course, interpretation. How to really look at art and interpret it, how to consider what message is being given to you. So this is the interpretation really is the highest skill because it's part of that synthesis of your learning outcomes. How to take information and learn to synthesize it. So I just again have a few slides here about the various things you might be able to learn how to think about that. For instance, formalism. Really, how is an art piece constructed? You're going to be reading chapter 3. It's called The Principles of Design. And they'll be getting into, that chapter will be getting more into these concepts. But just looking here, for instance, at David's Oath of the Horatii, you're looking at, how is something composed? How is it put together? We could use this painting essentially to break down the idea of how things look. So, for instance, this idea of thinking about a triangle shape, as far as something that is stable and holds a composition together, holds your eye there. Something like this background, having this way of being something that reiterates the three different groups. I'd say, ultimately, this is a very formal composition within formalism. But, I often speak a lot to my students about, what is a very stable composition like this? And then let's say, what are some unstable compositions such as these? These are both from the Mannerist period, where the previous one was from the neoclassical period. And when we get to the time periods, we'll talk a lot about how each time period kind of has its own way of formally setting up a scene. Mannerism, you'll notice, is the opposite of neoclassicism, where you don't have sort of a stable compositional setup. You have, for instance, with Pontormo's, you have this composition that swirls you around. I always compare it to like a washing machine swirling you around in circles with no place for your eye to rest. There's really no focal point in the piece. And then the Correggio piece is sort of like a corkscrew leading your eye up and around. Both of these paintings kind of make me seasick in a good way because I like them because they're unusual, but they're not usually what your painting teacher tells you to do, right? So you can learn a lot about formalism in this class. Art history. I put up Leonardo's Mona Lisa again, along with his Universal Man, because, again, this chapter has a huge amount of discussion about the Mona Lisa. So, and you'll notice it's telling you the story about the piece, how it gets stolen from the museum, and a lot of art histories, the stories behind the works. My students often find that they may have seen an artwork before many, many times. But then I tell them these intricate stories and they're like, well, I never knew any of that. That brings the work to life. So art history really brings the context, the stories into focus for you. You learn a lot about religion in art history classes because, as I mentioned before, religion is the foundation to a lot of different art pieces. So again, just a smattering of different types of religious pieces here. Anything from our Yoruban nut thrower to Shiva, the god of destruction, to the interior of church, a Shinto temple, a Confucian statue. And, we always say really the origins of religion start early in art history, all the way back in prehistory with the Venus of Willendorf, who is a fertility figure, and cave paintings, which we think were meant to call to the animals so that they come and we could hunt them. So we think of this as being very early mysticism, religion, however you want to frame it. You learn how to interpret art. This is the famous Venus of Urbino by Titian. It's a Venetian Renaissance piece. And when I talk about this in class, I talk about how there's kind of two different interpretations to the piece. There's a very traditional interpretation that this is a wedding portrait, and the women in the background are getting her items together in her wedding chest and getting her clothes together because she's about to go get married, right? But then there's a side reading and a side interpretation, we might say, that she's a courtesan, that she's sort of this kept woman of the Duke of Urbino. The flowers let us know that the Duke is coming to visit her. The dog represents fidelity. He's sleeping. But this is like sort of a saucy, nude, picture meant for the Duke's enjoyment. That's got nothing to do with marriage. So you'll notice that I didn't tell you which interpretation is correct because we're not really sure. Some people side with the traditional, some people side with the courtesan. So interpretation isn't always easy, is my point. And it takes a lot of looking at what's in the painting often to figure it out. And then I often say you can go with a sort of idea of a personal versus a factual interpretation. I tell my students quite often that the facts are the facts. You can't change the facts, right? But there are theories about things. And the theory can be very interesting, but not provable, right? But facts are things that are unflinching. They're unchanging. For instance, this is Fragonard's The Swing. It's from the Rococo period. Those are facts. I can't change those things. But then you can get into what's subjective and what's objective as far as interpreting these pieces. What's truth, what's maybe theory. And I often say, how we look at a piece, how we interpret a piece comes down to ourselves, which gets to the subjective versus objective. Objective is just, it is what it is. Subjective is, it's about you. It's about what you think, right? A lot of life ends up being subjective because it's how we feel about something. It doesn't mean it's the truth. In this piece, for instance, I often use this because I love the painting. It's one of my favorite paintings from the Rococo, because the Rococo was a very frisky, fun, sexualized kind of time period. And that appeals to me for whatever reason. And I always find this painting to be kind of jokey and funny, which I enjoy. So the premise of the painting is you have this lady, she's on the swing. She's being pushed by a guy in the background. And we often interpret him like a church figure, a church bishop, somehow related to the church. So he's pushing her, right? And they're having a good time. She's kicking off her shoe. I'll get to that in a minute. And then kind of throwing up her legs, and her petticoats are flying out, right? And then you look in the bush and there is her boyfriend kind of hanging out like, ooh la la. They're French, right? So we can say ooh la la. So almost in a sense, she's kind of tricked this guy into coming and pushing her on the swing while she gives her boyfriend a little show. The shoe, by the way, a shoe off the foot back then, like a shoe coming off a woman's foot, meant lost virginity. So that adds another layer. And you'll notice that the shoe is taking off across the picture plane and is heading towards that little cupid with its, we think it's a cupid anyway, with its finger to its mouth, representing discretion. And she's being anything but discreet, let's face it. She's like, woo, having a great time. Now, I think this is hilarious. I love this idea of her kind of pulling the wool over the one guy's eyes, right, and tricking him. And she's playful and fanciful in her little pink dress, her bubblegum pink dress. And this other guy's like, woo woo, I think it's kind of funny. But I had a student in my class, and we're actually still very good friends, and she was rather religious, and I am not. And she was like, I find that painting really offensive because it's basically tricking this man of God into doing her like sexual favor for her. And I was like, oh, okay, I can see where maybe from your perspective, your subjective place, right, you don't like the painting, but I do. And again, we're great friends, so we talk all the time about how she views art through a very specific lens of interpretation, and I may view it through a very specific lens of interpretation. Part of this class is art appreciation, right, is figuring out what's your interpretation. With that, I'll leave you thinking about chapter 2 coming up and the work for that. But I'll also leave with you, please make sure you've done your quiz, your chapter quiz for the week, and any other work that's assigned. And I hope you enjoyed chapter 1.